Right. Oh, good evening again, everyone. I'm Julie Holland, and I'm coming to you from Festus, Missouri, just south of St. Louis.
And I'm Carla Weinhold, and I'm coming from you from Bel Air, Maryland, which is a suburb of Baltimore.
We're glad to have everyone with us tonight. We want to go ahead and look. Okay, it looks like, there we go. Had just a technical glitch for a moment. I was afraid we were frozen. Tonight's objective is that we hope that we're going to help you develop a better understanding of that third dimension of the C3 framework and how active classroom and other sources can support this inquiry-based instructional approach for your students. So at any point, if you have questions that come up, just please use the chat feature, and tonight's moderator will be able to chime in so we can address the questions as they arise.
So if you look at the C3 framework, you can see that it's centered on the inquiry arc. Its architects described it as a set of interlocking and mutual supportive ideas that frame the way our students learn social studies content. So it's not necessarily looking at each piece in isolation, but how they work together like pieces to the puzzle. The arc focuses on the nature of inquiry in general, why we ask questions, and on how our students pursue knowledge through questioning. It begins with the construction of compelling and supporting questions, moves them through looking at different items through the different disciplinary tools and lenses, and considers those questions and supporting the documents. Then it moves through what we're talking about tonight, evaluating and using the evidence to support a conclusion that they're making, or take an informed action, which will be addressed in a later session. Our discussion tonight will help us prepare students to use critical thinking and core ELA skills as well to navigate numerous and varied types of sources. So if you take a look at the next slide, when we look at why in the classroom should we use the C3 framework, if we think about our young students in our elementary classrooms, we know that they need strong tools and disciplined, structured thinking to be able to look at the world from that lens of what we look at as the college, career, and civic life. We need to help build the tools so that they can see the world that way. The C3 framework provides different models and disciplined thinking to help our students unpack all the materials and details associated with social studies, but C3 does not provide the curriculum. So this is what you pair along with your curriculum. It's the roadmap on how our students can approach learning with an inquiry mindset.
So as Carla mentioned, the framework is not intended to specify particular curricular content, but it does enhance those national curriculum standards and learning expectations. So in focusing on Dimension 3 for tonight, you can see the alignment with what learners need to understand. And what I think is particularly important to note tonight is that intentional alignment with a priority ELA goal, which is drawing evidence from informational text to draw conclusions. So when we think of college and career ready, we often focus on those high school students, but how we get our seniors to a point of readiness for college, career, and civic responsibility begins from the moment that they enter kindergarten. So if we take just a few minutes to look at a vertical breakdown of the suggested pathways in Dimension 3 for gathering and evaluating sources, we can see that the foundation for gathering sources begins way back in K2 with using information from just one or two sources. Then in grades 3 through 5, our students work with multiple sources. By the time they're in middle school, we're asking students to work with multiple sources and then consider whether those sources corroborate with others. And then finally, you can see by high school that students not only meet all those preceding criteria for gathering sources, but they also must gather and use those multiple sources with a wide range of views. If we look at this section on evaluating sources, we can start pulling out some of the verbs that create that increasing complexity for evaluating.
Hey, Julie, I'm
Yes.
going to interrupt you for a minute. I think you need to go back. I think we're on slide 9, and I think we need to be on slide 7.
Did I bump up? Sorry.
There we go.
Hold on. Am I good?
Yes.
Yep, sorry about that. So now on this slide, we're going to go ahead and pull out some of the verbs that can show that increasing complexity for evaluating sources from K-12. So again, our youngest learners are simply learning to distinguish fact from opinion. Then our upper elementary students build on that skill to determine the credibility of sources. Then as students enter middle school, they're asked to go beyond that fact and opinion to determine the credibility and to consider relevance and intended use. And then finally, our high school students not only consider fact versus opinion in multiple sources and the intended use, but they're also asked to consider how experts value the sources to ultimately determine the credibility of those sources. There we go. So let's keep going with these pathways. When and how we begin asking students to develop their claims, again, builds gradually from that firm foundation in elementary school, when students are asked to just identify evidence from multiple sources to answer compelling questions. And you'll notice that that expectation doesn't begin in K2, but begins in 3rd grade with that expectation that students will have a strong foundation by the time they leave as 5th graders. And finally, when we look at using evidence, we can again see that our youngest learners aren't expected to use that evidence to develop a claim until they're in 3rd through 5th grades. But by 8th grade, not only are they making claims, but they're also making counterclaims. And finally, our high school students refine that thinking.
So we want you to take a minute to kind of pause and reflect and think about what you've learned about this 3rd dimension of the C3 framework, and think about what your key takeaways are. If you have questions, we'd like for you to use the chat feature to be able to see how comfortable you are with the suggested pathways in Dimension 3 for your particular grade level for work. And we'd also like you to share, has your school or district fully aligned with C3 framework? Or is your school somewhere in the process of adapting this? Is it something completely new for you? So we'll give you a minute or so to kind of think about where you are. I know in Maryland, we use the C3 framework. It's not embedded into our curriculum, but it's something that's encouraged and supported throughout when we're doing our professional development, when we're talking about data, when we're talking about instruction in our classrooms.
And Carla, I feel like this may be one of those pieces that has that trickle down effect, that we might see it implemented first in high school and middle school and eventually in elementary. Not that it should be that way, but I feel like that tends to be the case sometimes in developing these new frameworks.
I agree. I think as professional development and vertical teaming opportunities come, I know I am in a school that's 6 through 12, and we've had a lot of discussion over the last 4 or 5 years about our AP students and our honor students, what their writing expectations are, and then we've kind of backed that up. Okay, well, in order for them to be able to write that strong DBQ essay or thesis statement, what do we need to do for them in middle school? So we have broken that down and really looked at what skills can we directly model and teach and build into to enhance? And we're now seeing big results on our students on AP exams and their writing styles in the classroom.
That's awesome. And I really think that conversation kind of leads us into this next section of the presentation, when we're talking about how the C3 framework is connecting to our ELA standards. So I'm going to go ahead and move us on. Okay. Well, I say that.
One comment. Mike shared that they're an independent school and they use their C3 framework to create our division and grade level targets, so within their department. Thank you, Mike.
That's fantastic. Okay. There we go. So when we go ahead and we start thinking about connecting to the ELA standards, what I have seen is in the last 10 years, especially again at the elementary setting, there's been this increased push for proficiency in reading and math. And unfortunately, that means in a lot of elementary settings, social studies has kind of taken that back seat. But at the same time, there is a push for all teachers to teach reading across the curriculum. And as you can see, when teachers start shifting to that C3 framework for social studies, they're giving students the opportunity to put reading, speaking, and listening skills to work. There are 17 Common Core reading anchor standards within the ELA literacy standards that have that deep connection with Dimension 3. 3 of them that we've already been touching on are using the relevant evidence, using valid reasoning, and preparing for and participating effectively in those conversations and collaboration and partnerships in their classrooms. If we continue digging deeper into what research tells us makes for a skilled reader in any content area, we can take a look at this great illustration that shows what reading is. It's like a tightly woven cord with threads of language comprehension braided with word recognition, or what we might think of as fluency. So when we go beyond fluency and we look at 2 of those components in language comprehension, we see vocabulary and background knowledge as 2 vital pieces of that thread. And social studies is that perfect place to deeply integrate those reading skills. The best way to build vocabulary is through exposure and content. And where does a vast majority of vocabulary growth occur in school? In social studies. If we look at Robert Marzano's research for building background knowledge for academic achievement, we see that 55.4% of a student's academic vocabulary comes from those social studies disciplines. So what implication does that have for us as teachers? Well, when you're teaching social studies, especially when you're using primary and secondary sources, you're helping build students' reading comprehension and vocabulary in significant ways. Conversely, if we're denying our students that time as readers in social studies, we're creating huge deficits for them as readers. So if we think about what that means in social studies, even though at the elementary level, social studies isn't tested as a state standardized test alone, but they need document-based questions, research skills, and nonfiction reading, because those are heavily weighted on every state exam, and they need practice in meaningful ways. What I pulled here is a typical example from the ELA portion, the writing assessment of our Missouri grade 4 end of year exam. And in this assessment, the students are given 2 sources, one that's a historical description of cowboys' clothing, and one that's more of a science-based explanation of body and heat loss. And then they have the following prompt. Clothing plays an important role in people's daily lives at work, at school, in the outdoors, and at other places. Consider how certain articles of clothing are best for certain places and situations. And in their information, you'll see that they are prompted to be sure to use details and examples from both passages to support your ideas. So even though this is an ELA test, it's clear that students have to incorporate knowledge with their own schema or what they know about the world already, and they have to cite sources. Now,
Julia, oh, sorry, I was going to chime in because this is, I think, the same for a lot of our other states, because even in Maryland, we have the same thing. Some of those same skills and strategies that they're being tested on in ELA, they're using some of these social studies based texts or concepts as the tool to kind of deliver the information or to assess the skills.
Absolutely, absolutely. And think about how much more confident and successful a student is going to be if this reading, this content is something somewhat familiar than reading about new content for the first time on a test.
And being able to know, oh, I know I have to cite evidence. I know how to do that. So if they don't have to worry about the process of citing evidence and being able to analyze the source, they can then focus on the reading if they're comfortable with the skills.
Absolutely, because hopefully we have embedded practice upon practice upon practice of citing evidence throughout their day, especially in social studies, where again, it's meaningful. It's not just for the sake of citing evidence.
So if we look at the application to the secondary classroom, when we get to focus on social studies or history or geography or civics or economics for anywhere from 45 minutes to, in some high school classrooms, when you get the 80 or 90-minute blocks, we get to every day focus on these history skills. But I think as secondary teachers, sometimes we come at this from the content and we forget the tools and strategies that some of our elementary counterparts naturally blend and weave in their instruction, especially when they can blend ELA instruction. So I think we have to remember to intentionally plan opportunities for our students to practice these reading and writing skills within our history content in classrooms that we're teaching about. So one way to do that is to look at the sources framework, and it's just a strategy for steps on how to read multiple sources, on how to being able to look at where is this information coming from? What organized thoughts can I do? I always have my students, when they're looking at a source, what do you see? What do you wonder? I like my kids to annotate and write all over, because then it gets them to thinking and reading between the lines as they're looking at. I want them, can they find other sources, or can they corroborate ideas among the sources that they're given? And then once they get the bigger picture, then they can kind of bring all their thoughts and summarize together. There's another strategy called the cards strategy that helps them being able to analyze a website. Because a lot of our students think the first thing that pops up is the right answer. It's going to give me everything I need. And they don't always question the information that's in front of them. So this strategy is a good thing to teach them about credibility. And I think a lot of these steps need to be broken down into just minor, like mini lessons for each piece. And then if we look at the same, or the next slide, this is a task that I use with my students. A lot of times I will use the same strategy while they're kind of working on the second dimension, when they're evaluating the sources, because I like for them to look, what's the author's purpose? What are they trying to tell me? A lot of my students don't always think about bias. So I know when we teach about Charlemagne, I give them a couple different sources, and one of the sources is from a monk who happens to be a very good friend of Charlemagne. So the students don't question or wonder. I'm like, oh, he's such a wonderful person. And they're, yes, he's amazing. And then they're like, well, but this other source said that he's not so amazing. So then it's like, okay, well, let's look deeper into that source. What does the source tell us about the author? And they're like, oh, he's his friend. So just to have those pieces, they need to be able to look at the age. Is it relevant? So a lot of these skills and strategies are going to help them not only in the classroom, not only looking at history content, but as they go out into the world and become functioning members of our democratic society that we live in. So there's a great article on the C3 Teachers blog. If you've never checked out the C3 Teachers blog, it's definitely an excellent resource to check out. It's actually by Carly, I think it's Muertes, and it was written on February 14th of this year. And the title is called Swimming in Sources and Selecting Sources to Propel Inquiry. So we always have to find this balance of giving our kids the right amount of sources. We don't want to give them too many. We don't want to give them not enough that they can't find the evidence to support the position we want. So she states that selecting sources is a delicate balance. We want our students to have the variety of perspectives. We don't want them to just look at one side, but we don't want to overwhelm them with too many sources, because if they spend too much time trudging through the material, they might lose focus about the content or the context or even the evidence that's in the source, because they're worried about getting through all of the sources that we want them to get. So having 4 or 5 really good, solid sources that have varied perspectives is probably your best strategy. She also, in that same article, continues to give advice on things that teachers need to remember as they're planning, that we cannot include everything. I think especially as history teachers, we try to give everything. We want them to see every perspective, every ounce of it, and that can sometimes overwhelm us. That we need to focus, what's the content angle? Do we have something to be able to look at the civics perspective or the economics or geography? Can we give them enough evidence to support that compelling question that we're creating with them, or their supporting questions that they came up with? Can we use these ideas then to narrow down the sources so we have the focus on specifically what we need? Another strategy that I really enjoy using with my students is called bucketing. There are a lot of different strategies to do this. I know sometimes with my students who struggle a little more, I get out the old-fashioned sentence strips that a lot of us had either as students or I know when I started teaching, and I actually write their big ideas, and then we start sorting them into, I don't have buckets, but I use my little clear Rubbermaid totes, and we actually pick the 3 big ideas and we start sorting our ideas. My students did this today. They're reading sources about the impact that the Nile River had on life in Egypt. And they looked at how did the Nile affect them economically? How did it affect them geographically? How did it affect them when they're looking at spirituality? So they were starting to look at all these, and as they're getting facts, they're starting to sort them into their bins. So the buckets ultimately can become that evidence piece when they're starting to support that particular frame of mind. And for some students, they can do this without a physical putting things in a bucket. They may be able to do a graphic organizer. Some students, as you practice this, will be able to do this kind of without thinking and without writing it down. So if we look at dimension 3 in action, I am a big component, especially with my middle school students, is I like to give them a lot of graphic organizers, especially when my students are looking at sources. This is one that I use with my students all the time. I have them write the source. I also have them summarize the source, and I tell them it's just a gist, because a lot of times they'll write, this is source A. Which is great, except for then they have to go back and find out, okay, is source A a chart about the planting and flooding and growing season and harvesting seasons in Egypt? And then we asked them to write, for this one was talking about the Gothic cathedrals, is what does it tell us? So what was their big idea? It was about the impact of Gothic cathedrals in the Middle Ages. So for the one that they used today, was what was the impact that the Nile had, what that source was sharing. So another thing that I spend a lot of time, and I've been doing a lot of that since school started in September, is how to annotate. I like to give my students structure and purpose. I did this a lot with my elementary. I would give them sticky notes, and they love sticky note reading. They would put a little symbol in the corner. Is it a question? Is it a smiley face because they like something? Is it a frown face because, you know, they didn't agree with that? Kind of gives them some purpose, especially when they're looking at a variety of sources, both if they're looking at primary and secondary. They can kind of record their thinking, and then they can use that graphic organizer or that annotated text when they do the discussion. I like my students to discuss. So if we look at the next slide, then you can see I like to have my students work in groups. So these are some of my students actually examining and evaluating. They're looking at the sources. I like my Rubbermaid tubs, so they're making notes. They're recording their thoughts on their graphic organizers. And there's a few more on the next slide as well. So I like the resources that Active Classroom has. So if you look at the debating the documents, the decision making, a lot of these activities that are embedded within Active Classroom give you a lot of the sources. There are some great C3 lessons built in within the Active Classroom. This is one of the Active Classroom lessons that my students are doing in these pictures. And it gives the students the ability to look at all these sources, and it gives the teacher the chance, because the sources are kind of already narrowed down for you. So which leads us to our next slide, looking at what resources do you have available to you as teachers and then for your students.
Yes, and Carla, I think just like you mentioned Active Classroom, the beauty of this work anymore is that you don't have to create lessons or find resources, create templates from scratch on your own. You can spend time in places like the National Archives or the Library of Congress websites, and you can find resources for your students, such as those source analysis sheets for various grade levels and sources. And then for teachers, you also have more and more of those documents for document collections based on topics and grade levels to full lessons.
There's also great resources on the C3 teachers blog. So there's a lot of resources out there, whether you're just starting implementing or whether you are kind of immersed in the process.
So before we close out for the night, we just wanted to hear from you one more time what your key takeaways were from tonight's webinar, or on a scale of 1 to 10, now how comfortable do you feel implementing Dimension 3? Or if you have any other questions or thoughts you'd like to post, go ahead and share those with us for a moment.
Mike commented that he loves Active Classroom. So that's awesome to hear, Mike. So I know that I like elements of Active Classroom because they have student guides and teachers guides. You can use them print-based, you can use them web-based.
So we hope you're going away with something valuable from this evening, and that you're feeling more confident in your work as you move forward through Dimension 3 of the framework.
And we can do a plug for our webinar on Dimension 4 coming up in November. I think it's the November 26th. So there are also 2 other webinars for the first 2 dimensions.
Already available or
yes.
coming? Yes. So we thank you for spending time with us and getting more comfortable with this work in Dimension 3. I hope everyone has a great week and a happy Halloween ahead. And Carla,
Enjoy the week ahead. Thanks, guys.